Okay, today we're going to talk about consumer choice and utility analysis, and what that does is allow us to see what point on the budget line we're going to choose, the consumer is going to choose, and derive the consumer's demand. Okay, so we saw a budget line before with apples and oranges, and here's the budget line, and we said that you can choose any point on the budget line. What consumer choice theory is going to do is allow us to predict what point on this budget line the person is going to choose. And then that's going to allow us to derive the consumer's demand curve. Okay? So in order to do this, the first thing we have to do is define utility. So the utility of a particular bundle of the goods, apples and oranges, is the satisfaction level the consumer gets from choosing a particular amount of both goods. So it's the satisfaction level the consumer gets from consuming a bundle of goods. Okay, and it's going to be a real number. So what we're assuming is that you can assign a real number to any particular bundle of goods that the consumer is going to consume, and that bundle of goods and that number represents the amount of satisfaction the consumer gets from consuming that bundle of goods. And the higher the index number, the more the consumer likes the bundle of goods. So if if you look at two bundles and one of them has a higher index number than the other, then you prefer the one with the higher index number. So for example, if we looked at having 10 apples and 10 oranges and we assign the number 120 to that, then if we looked at 12 apples and 10 oranges, what we know is that the utility of that bundle is going to be higher than 120 because you prefer having more apples. That would also mean that the utility of having, having 10 apples and 12 oranges would also be above 120 because we'd prefer to have more oranges. What we don't know yet is whether the utility of 12-10 is bigger than the utility of 10-12. That's why we have to come up with this scheme of utility so that we can rank or know which one the person is going to choose between bundles 12-10 and 10-12. Bundles like that where you have more of one good and less of the other one. Okay? Now, what the consumer is assumed to be trying to do is make himself as happy as he can, or give himself the highest utility he can, given that he has to stay on the budget line. So you're trying to get the maximum utility you can afford, given you have to stay on the budget line. So maximize utility given stay on the budget line. Okay, so what the consumer is doing is allocating dollars between buying the two goods, between buying some apples and buying some oranges, in such a way that you maximize the utility that you get. Okay? The question is, you have a certain amount of these goods dollars, and you want to allocate these goods, these dollars, between buying the two goods. So you're going to spend $1 on an apple, or you're going to spend, let's say, $1 on buying oranges, and you're going to allocate those dollars in such a way that you maximize the amount of utility you get. Okay? Well, let's look at the particular consumer equilibrium that gives you the maximum utility. Okay, so the consumer is going to maximize his utility when he consumes the bundle for which the marginal utility of good 1 divided by the price of good 1 equals the marginal utility of good 2 divided by the price of good 2. Okay, so I defined what utility is. So now what we want to do is define marginal utility. So the marginal utility of apples is the change in utility for the change in apples, which means it's the change in utility you get per consuming 1 more apple given the amount of oranges you have, and it's considered to be positive, which means when you get another apple, your total utility goes up. The marginal utility of oranges is the change in utility for the change in oranges. It's the change in utility you get when you consume 1 more orange given the amount of apples that you consume, and it's again considered to be positive, so that oranges are good. When you get more oranges, you get more utility. Okay, so this is the change in utility. Then we assume diminishing marginal utility. Which means as you consume more and more of a good, the extra utility you get from consuming that good goes down. Okay? So that means as you consume more and more apples, the marginal utility of the next apple goes down. And you could think of it this way. If you're very, very hungry, you haven't eaten anything yet, and then you consume 1 apple, that's going to satisfy your hunger a lot. So you get a lot of extra utility from that. But now that you've eaten 1 apple, if you eat another apple, you weren't quite as hungry, so that doesn't satisfy you quite as much. And so it doesn't give you as much extra utility. And by the time you've eaten, let's say, 4 apples, you can see that eating the 5th apple is going to give you a lot less extra utility than you had before. That's what diminishing marginal utility means. What it means is your marginal utility looks like this. As you get more and more of the good, you get less marginal utility, but your total utility is going up at an increasing rate. So this is total utility of apples. And this is apples. Okay. So what the consumer is doing is allocating their income between the buying of the 2 goods, apples and oranges, in order to maximize their utility. Okay? What we're going to assume the consumer is doing is maximizing utility. Okay. So this is the budget line. We assume that of all these points on the budget line, the one the consumer is going to choose is the one that maximizes your utility. So you're going to maximize utility given you stay on the budget line. Okay. Now, the amount of both goods that's going to maximize your utility is the one for which the marginal utility of apples divided by the price of apples equals the marginal utility of oranges divided by the price of oranges, and you're on the budget line. Okay, again, what the consumer is doing is allocating dollars between buying the two goods. So you're allocating how many dollars you want to put on buying apples and how many dollars you want to put on buying oranges. And that's going to give you the amount of both goods that you consume. The one that maximizes utility is when the marginal utility of apples divided by the price of apples equals the marginal utility of oranges divided by the price of oranges. Okay, what does this ratio mean? This ratio here means that if you spend $1 on apples, you get $1 divided by the price of apples, amount of apples. That's a certain amount of apples. It's $1 worth of apples. If you take that and then you multiply it by the marginal utility of apples, what you get is the change in utility per dollar spent on an apple. Okay, it's the change in utility per dollar spent on apple. And then this ratio here is the change in utility per dollar spent on oranges. Okay, so these two ratios are equal when you can't change the way you reallocate your dollars and get higher utility. Okay, let's assume that the point where you maximize utility is at point A on this budget line over here, point A. But right now you're buying at point B, so you're over here. Okay, so you're buying too many oranges in a sense. You're buying more oranges than maximize your utility. Okay, well, these ratios aren't going to be equal, and in fact, what's true then at point B is that this ratio the marginal utility of apples divided by the price of apples is greater than the marginal utility of oranges divided by the price of oranges. What does that mean? That means I'm spending all my money at point B. So I'm spending the $30, let's say. But if I buy $1 worth more of apples, so I move down the budget line to buy a few more apples, that the extra utility I get is greater than the utility I lose from no longer spending that dollar on buying oranges. Okay? So that would mean, for example, that if I took $1 away from spending on oranges, I buy a little bit less orange. I lose a little bit of utility, but that I spend that entire dollar on apples, then I gain this much utility, and the amount of utility I gain is bigger than the utility that I lose, so my total utility goes up. So if I change my spending from buying $1 worth less of orange and $1 worth more of apple, I'm going to move down to point C, and my utility is going to go up. Okay? Then at point C, we still want to buy more apples, so this ratio is still greater than this one. This marginal utility falls a little bit because I have more apples. This marginal utility of orange goes up a little bit because I have fewer oranges, but it's still true that this ratio is greater, So I increase utility again if I buy more apples and fewer oranges. And that keeps happening until I move all the way down to point A. As I move down from point C to point A, this marginal utility is going down. This marginal utility is going up. They're going to meet in the middle, let's say at point A, and that means at point A I've maximized my utility, because now I can't change how I spend the additional dollar and get higher utility. Okay? So what you're looking for, or how you're going to tell what point on the budget line maximizes your utility, is the one for which the marginal utility of apples divided by the price of apples equals the marginal utility of oranges divided by the price of oranges.